For family members, as parents of children with disabilities, and I have 2 children with disabilities myself, you spent your child's whole life trying to help them to be as independent as possible, to be able to live as independently as possible, and now, when they're on the brink of legal independence and becoming legal adults, you're faced with the prospect of having to go into court and say, no, they're not able to do that. What I encourage folks to think about is this. Don't confuse rights with independence. And what I mean by that is that sometimes guardianship is the appropriate way to go. Guardianship is necessary to help some persons with disabilities be able to live as high a quality of life and as independently as possible. And that may sound contradictory, but it's really not. And the independence part of it is just because you may have to go to court to have a guardianship established for your son or daughter doesn't mean that they lose their independence. Yes, some rights may be removed, but you can still encourage them and assist them and help them to live as independently and function as independently as they possibly can, even though you may need to take that legal step to have legal authority in certain circumstances. So, again, while it's not a pleasant prospect, and I understand that, don't confuse rights with independence. Now, finally on this point, I want to talk about the alternatives to guardianship, and the primary alternative to guardianship is going back to what we talked about before, power of attorney. Your child with a disability, when they turn 18, they can sign over to you or sign in your favor a power of attorney for you to be able to take actions on their behalf, deal with their property, do various things for them, just as if you were them. Give you access to medical records, give you access to all sorts of things. That's great. That's all well and good. However, keep in mind, the power of attorney is completely voluntary, which means that a legal adult, I can sign a power of attorney in favor of somebody right now. 5 minutes from now, I can turn around and say, no, I've changed my mind, and tear it up. Or sign another piece of paper that says, no, I revoke that power of attorney that I just gave in favor of that person. Now, that can be an issue. That can be an issue with in relationships between particularly parents and children, siblings, you know, in relationships that are harmonious all of the time, where you don't have disputes, you don't have fights about things, that's fine. A power of attorney may be the appropriate way to go, and you may not ever need to go beyond that. But in my experience, there are very few human relationships that are harmonious all of the time, and where you don't have disputes of some sort, particularly amongst family members. That's just part of who we are. And I've seen many situations where persons with disabilities have executed powers of attorney and then decided, no, that's not the way I want to go. And for planning purposes, then their parents are left in the lurch, and their now adult child with disabilities has complete freedom and complete authority to be able to do such things as enter into contracts, buy a car, decide to get married, decide where they want to live, decide what they want to do with their money, all of those types of things. So, power of attorney may be very useful, but it may be necessary also from a planning perspective to go further into looking at one of the forms of guardianship. Excuse me. Now, it's also important to be ready to take these steps, as I mentioned earlier, when the person with disabilities turns 18. What I suggest is that if you think that some sort of guardianship is appropriate, or taking some additional steps like having a power of attorney drawn up. If you think those things are going to be appropriate, don't wait until the person with disabilities turns 18. Start on their 17th birthday. If necessary, make an appointment with a lawyer. Go get legal advice as to what's the best thing legally for you and for your family and for your loved one with disabilities. And then, if you need to go further with guardianship proceedings, start the paperwork then. Start the paperwork then, because you can't file a guardianship proceeding before someone turns 18. But if you start when they're 17 with preparing the paperwork, then you will have everything in line. You'll have everything ready to go. When they turn 18, you can file the paperwork immediately, and you can reduce the window of potential problems. And potential problems like a lot of calls I used to get from parents frantic in an emergency room saying, "Rich, my child was in an accident. They're over 18. We haven't gotten guardianship, and the doctors and the nurses are saying that we can't consent to treatment, and they can't get my child to communicate with them. What do we do now?" Well, that's a problem, and that's an extreme type of a problem, but again, it's a problem that comes up on a regular basis. You don't want that to happen to you if at all possible. So if you have everything ready to go when your child turns 18, then you can minimize the possibility of those types of things happening. Last piece of the puzzle that I want to talk about in terms of planning, but it's a crucial piece of the puzzle, is special needs trusts. Now, special needs trusts can be absolutely vital when you have a family member who has disabilities. And when you start talking about trusts, a lot of people say, well, trusts are just for people who have an awful lot of money. Well, no, that's not true. In today's society, again, keep in mind, if your loved one has more than $2,000 worth of your money, your property, or property or money that they get themselves, then they can become ineligible for benefits. You don't want that to happen. By using a properly drafted special needs trust, you can avoid that happening. Also, I like to talk about creating the future for persons with disabilities when we're talking about special needs trust, because that's really what you're doing. By putting in time, by putting in thought, and putting in effort on the front end of putting together a special needs trust, you can really, truly create the future for the person with disabilities by making sure that they have the highest quality of life, the greatest degree of independence as possible in their circumstances, and the most resources available to them, instead of just sitting back and hoping and praying that everything will just work out some way if you're not around. Now, that can be, as I said, absolutely critical, and the effort that you put in on the front end will absolutely pay off in the back end in terms of improved quality of life, improved independence for your loved one with disabilities. Now, special needs trusts have one purpose and one purpose only. Everything else is window dressing. It's important window dressing, but it's window dressing. That one purpose is simply this. Special needs trusts are created so that people with disabilities can put money, can put property into a special needs trust and still qualify for government benefits like Medicaid, like SSI. The government pretends that money doesn't exist, and the person with disabilities still gets the Medicaid, still gets the SSI, which may be absolutely essential to literally their survival. So that's the sole purpose that special needs trusts exist. That's the only reason they're around, but it's a very, very important purpose.